Hey everybody, I'm Natasha Kirchuk, and thanks for joining us for ILTV's weekly program, One-on-One with Alan Dershowitz. We want to give you, our viewers, a chance to have your questions answered by Professor Dershowitz, one of America's greatest legal minds. He's a leading expert on criminal and constitutional law, civil liberties, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Hi, Professor Dershowitz.
Hi.
So great to have you again. You're in Miami Beach this time around, so we're all jealous of you over here. All right, so let's get started. Professor, as you know, every week we open our show with some special guests. Now, this week we're honored to have several special guests. Just recently, events in both the U.S. and Israel have led to fierce battles between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government in both countries. And our first guest is Israeli member of Knesset Sharon Haskell from the governing Likud party. She's going to ask a very short question about the new Israeli settlement law, which is making headlines.
Hi, my name is Sharon Haskell. I'm an MK from the Likud party here in Israel. I would like to start with thanking you, Alan Dershowitz, for all of this amazing work that you do for the state of Israel. Now, I would like to ask you a very important question. This week we've passed a bill called the Settlement Regulation Bill. This bill had many reporters had different opinions about this particular bill. I do think, though, that overseas people don't understand the legal situation about properties in Judea and Samaria. I would like to hear what's your take about this bill.
Well, thank you very much, Sharon, and thank you for the work you do on behalf of Israel. You know, you thank me for what I do on behalf of Israel, but the Israeli Knesset's making my job a lot harder. This bill, forget about the legality, is a disaster from the point of view of those of us who are trying to defend Israel. It puts Israel in the position of being a country that takes land from private owners. Sure, there's compensation, but this is not a bill that I think has any support anywhere around the world, certainly not in the United States, not even by the Trump administration, and my understanding is it does not have support in Israel, that it is strongly opposed by a significant number of Israelis. It's bad politics, it's bad policy. I believe in the end it will be declared to be bad legally. Fortunately, the Israeli Supreme Court maintains an interest. You don't have the same kind of Supreme Court as we do. You don't have separation of powers and checks and balances and an independent equal judiciary. In your system of government, Knesset prevails over the Supreme Court, at least in theory, if not in practice. I'm confident that the Supreme Court of Israel will have something to say about this law, but I am opposed to it. I think it is an invitation to the International Criminal Court to look harder at what Israel is doing. And, you know, when you're in a conflict like this, things should not get resolved on technical legal grounds. One should look at the politics. One should look at what the best interests long-term are of the country. And I think the interests of Israel are in a two-state solution. And a two-state solution will require that Israel remain within the major settlement blocks and exchange those settlement blocks for land currently owned by Israel. This will make it a little more difficult. Now, I am not one of those who believes that the settlement issues are the major barrier to peace. They're not. The major barrier to peace is the Palestinians' refusal to recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people and to come to the bargaining table with no preconditions and to accept the kinds of offers that were made to them in 2000, 2001, and 2008. So I don't think this is the major barrier to peace, but I do think it makes it much more difficult to defend Israel in the court of public opinion and in international fora abroad. So I'm hoping that this will be reconsidered by the Knesset, and if not, it will have a hard look by the Supreme Court of Israel.
Now, you know, this law was passed before the Prime Minister has had his meeting with President Trump. Why do you think that happened? Do you think this is kind of, you know, the Israeli government staking out a maximum position on this issue before a negotiation?
No, I don't. You say the Israeli government. Tragically, there's no such thing as the Israeli government. Unlike the United States, where you have a president who appoints his cabinet, and the cabinet is all loyal to him, he can fire them at a moment's notice. The coalition government that Israel has been governed under forever is not an operative, functioning government. What you have is the extreme right in Israel putting pressure on the government, threatening constantly to topple it by breaking up the coalition. So I don't think that this law necessarily represents the personal views of those in all of those in the government of Israel.
Well, the prime minister himself, there are reports that he wasn't privately supporting this law passing.
On many occasions in the past, there are those in the government who have tried to embarrass the prime minister by passing, housing expansion. I always remember the time when my friend Joe Biden, who's a great man, a great supporter of Israel, came to Israel, and literally while he was having dinner with the prime minister, some housing people issued statements about expanding housing I think in that case it was East Jerusalem, and it caused tremendous embarrassment to the Vice President of the United States. I think it did to the Prime Minister of Israel, though I never spoke to him about that. And so in Israel, when you get an action of this kind, it represents the mix of government and the extreme right, the center right, the other parts of the government. And I think it's a tragedy that these kinds of domestic political issues sometimes make it much more difficult to defend Israel abroad, where Israel's interests must be defended. It would be a tragedy if the International Criminal Court took the case. It would be a mistake also for the International Criminal Court, but this certainly doesn't help Israel's posture in front of international bodies.
And I guess we're just going to have to wait and see how the White House truly responds to this move after the meeting between the two leaders. Now, Professor, we'll move on to our next question. As we mentioned, our developing struggle between branches of government are also paralleled by what's shaping up as a fierce battle in the USA between President Trump and the courts over his executive order restricting immigration. Retired Colonel Daniel Reisner teaches at both Tel Aviv University and the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya. He's a leading expert in homeland security and a partner at Israel's premier law firm, Herzog Fox Naaman, which was actually founded by the former president of Israel, Chaim Herzog, and the late Justice Minister, Yaakov Naaman. Let's hear from Colonel Reisner.
Hi, Alan. Great to do this. I fondly remember hosting you here at my office to jointly discuss BDS issues a few years ago, and of course, discussions when I was the head of the IDF International Department. So it looks like 2017 is shaping to be a very interesting year. In Israel, we have a potential constitutional crisis on our hands with the new bill relating to the West Bank, which leads me to another potential constitutional crisis in the US right now, where we're seeing the new US administration, President Trump, heading directly into collision course with the US judiciary. Now, obviously, by the time this airs, we may know the result of the appeals court decision on this issue, but it looks like this is not going to go away anytime soon, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. As far as I know, this is the first time a new US administration has generated such a potential constitutional crisis within the first few weeks of its existence. So looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this, Alan, and all the best.
Well, thank you so much. And Dan, you have contributed so much to the safety, security, and intellectual life of Israel. I fondly remember our meetings, and of course, I've worked closely with several members of your law firm. Yaakov Naaman was a close personal and professional friend, and we did a number of matters together. They're lucky to have you. You're lucky to have them. I don't consider what's going on in the United States at this point a constitutional crisis. It's a constitutional conflict. President Trump decided to appeal the adverse verdict instead of defying it. If he had defied it, it would have been a constitutional crisis because we have separation of powers and checks and balances. And he would have had at least a plausible basis because we have conflicting decisions. The federal district court in Washington enjoined the president's order suggesting it was unconstitutional. A federal district court in Massachusetts refused to extend an injunction suggesting it was constitutional. He could have followed the Massachusetts ruling, but instead he decided to appeal the ruling on the West Bank. That on the West Coast. That's a very good development. I think that the Trump administration will lose in the short term. The stay will remain in effect. But I think in the long term, they have a substantial chance of winning. I think the main argument that's been made is that this constitutes an establishment of religion because the 7 countries are all Muslim countries, and because the order specifies that minority religious members are not covered by the order. But I don't see that as unconstitutional. Think back to 1944, when the United States passed one of the most important statutes in its history, and that is the War Refugee Board statute that helped save at least tens of thousands of Jews from the Holocaust. That statute was directed at Jewish refugees. That didn't establish Judaism as the national religion of America. It recognized the fact that the victims of the Holocaust were Jews. And so you can have a statute or an order that is specifically focused on the problem. And the problem we face in the world today is twofold. One, radical Islamic terrorism. Yes, Islamic terrorism. It comes from radical Islamic organizations and countries that support them. And no one can dispute that Iran, for example, is a country that exports terrorism. So it's perfectly logical to put them on the list. And by the way, some of the countries on the list are Shia, some of the countries are Sunni. So they don't even represent the same essential religion. Remember, Sunni and Shia is not like Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform Judaism. They really are fundamentally different religions in many, many respects. And also, the victims of the extremism tend to be religious minorities, but not only Christians, also Baha'is, Kurds, in Shia countries, Sunnis, and Sunni countries, Shias. So I think in the end, the statute will survive an attack based on the Establishment Clause. There are other barriers. There's a statute that it may run afoul of, and there may be equal protection issues. In the end, I think we're going to see a divided decision, upholding some parts of the order and striking down other parts of the order. But it's not a crisis at this point. It's a conflict, and America is built on conflict. That's what checks and balances are all about.
That is true. Now, speaking of the U.S., you've commented a lot on the recent appointment of the Supreme Court Justice, Neil Gorsuch. Can you share with us your take on his appointment and what the court will look like in the future?
Well, he was a very distinguished student at Harvard Law School. He became a law clerk to a Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court. He's certainly well qualified by his background. He has views with which I fundamentally disagree. He doesn't believe that human beings essentially have the right to control their own destiny. He would prevent people from ending their lives if they are afflicted with painful and terminal illnesses. His views on gay rights are unclear. He cited favorably in his book a footnote by Justice Scalia, which mocked those who would support gay rights and other aspects of human autonomy. So he's a worrisome pick, but I think he has the credentials to be confirmed. The biggest opposition to him is the fact that this was not a seat that should have been filled by Donald Trump. It's a seat that should have been filled by the president who was sitting when the vacancy occurred a year ago. And President Obama tried to fill that with the appointment of Merrick Garland, who also I knew when he was a student at Harvard Law School and who has at least as good credentials. But the Republican Senate robbed Obama of his power to make that appointment by not even having hearings or an up and down vote, which I think is in violation at least of the spirit of the Constitution. So there are going to be some Democratic senators who simply are going to play tit for tat and fight fire with fire and refuse to support this nomination regardless of its credibility. So I think we're in for a fight, but in the end, Gorsuch, I think, will become the 9th Justice of the United States Supreme Court.
All right. Now, We want to change gears and discuss an issue of a completely different nature. Former spokesperson for the Prime Minister, Yoni Eisen, is a retired colonel who has a question from her heart. Today she wants to discuss an issue which is very close to both of you. Let's hear what's on her mind.
Hello, Professor Dershowitz. Miri Eisen. For so many years, I've stood in front of the camera and had to answer the questions on behalf of the State of Israel. What I've been doing for almost 10 years is mainly speaking with the liberal groups. I try to speak with them because I feel that it's something that we need to bridge over. I want to pose to you one of the challenges that I find as an Israeli, as a Zionist, and as somebody who does believe in universal values, the challenge that I have in the following question. At the end of the day, as an avid Zionist, I very much see Zionism as something particular. It is connected to Jewish nationhood. It's connected to our ancient connection to here, but it's about Jewishness. That's particularism. When you talk about universal values, in its own way, it stands in complete contradiction to the idea of Zionism. Zionism is not a universal value. It's a Jewish value. When I try and talk to liberal students, I find their biggest challenge is how can I be liberal, universal, and an avid Zionist? How would you answer that question?
Well, Miri, first of all, thank you for your great service to Israel and to universal values. I just fundamentally disagree with your premise that there's a conflict between liberal values and particularism. One of liberal values is diversity. And those liberals, same liberals who complain about Zionism, are perfectly happy to support Black power movements, Black dormitories, feminist movements, special privileges for people based on ethnicity, race, or a background. Look, I think liberalism is all about choice, and Zionism is a choice. Zionism is not a compulsion. It doesn't require me as a Jew to move to Israel. I can remain in America. I can become secular. I can become assimilated if I choose to. Zionism presents one of many options for Jews. It's also a rescue operation, and we see how important it has been rescuing 1 million Jews from Soviet oppression, rescuing Jews from as far-flung places as Uganda and most recently some South American countries where they have suffered discrimination and parts of Europe. So I see no conflict between Zionism and liberalism. Indeed, Zionism's founders were liberals. Herzl was a liberal. Ben-Gurion was certainly a liberal. I think that almost every country has some particularistic aspects. Great Britain, which is a, quote, liberal country, has an established church, and the Queen is the defender of the faith. Canada, a liberal country, has God in its national anthem. When the cross was to be taken out of European symbols, many in Europe called for it to remain because it's part of European history. So I think that Zionism is a very important part of liberalism. It's the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. And Woodrow Wilson talked about the United States supporting national liberation movements. He included Zionism as one of them. And I think Zionism was also a fight against colonialism. The Zionists fought hard against the colonialists of Great Britain and the Ottoman Empire and others. So I'm a proud liberal. I always try to make the case, the liberal case for Israel. I think Israel must remain a bipartisan issue. And I proudly make the liberal case for Israel. I'm in the process of writing a new book about that subject. And I'll be interested in your reaction once the book is published to see if I've successfully made the case that the particularism involved in Zionism is not only consistent with liberalism, but an important aspect of liberalism itself.
All right, well, I think Miri is going to be waiting for that book to come out. All right, Professor, our last guest is someone who you've known for many years. Yoni Kotler hails from Montreal, Canada, but now lives and works in Israel. Let's hear what he has to say.
Hi, Alan. Hope all's well. I wanted to ask you some things that have been on my mind recently as someone who grew up in a legal household, in a legal environment, despite the manner in which I ascribe to it personally. I always did also have a lot of personal respect for you, and recently came across a video of you discussing the BDS movement, and it elicited a few questions in my mind. You talked about how they purport themselves to be a growing and effective movement that is achieving its goals, where you actually gave the facts as they stand to be one where they are not achieving their stated goals. They may be making a lot of noise, but they're not actually contributing to any kind of marked increase in cultural or academic boycotts of Israeli institutions or individuals. So my question then is, how would you best dovetail the perceived reality, which amongst young people, especially on college campuses, that this is an effective, this is a growing, and this is an important movement, with the actual reality, as you put it, where this movement, despite its pace or noise, is not affecting real change. And so I would be curious to know how you would go about best explaining those differences and acquainting those who are not in the know with the facts, so that they can better argue the points themselves, see this movement for what it actually is, and hopefully become arbiters of the truth in their own right. Thank you very much.
Hey, Yoni, it's great to see you. As you remember, I was at your bar mitzvah. I've known you for a long, long time, and I'm so proud of what you've been doing and your decision to work in Israel. So keep doing great things. It's a great question, excellent question. And I think the answer is that the BDS movement has two goals. First of all, let's understand there's no such thing as the BDS movement. It's not a movement that's universal about all countries. It's not a movement to boycott countries that violate human rights. The BDS movement is only directed against the nation state of the Jewish people. It's a bigoted, anti-Semitic, targeted at Jews concept that no one should support. It has failed miserably on American campuses in one respect, that is, no American college campus will buy into any divestment or boycott, academic boycotts of Israel. But it has succeeded at the same time in generating support from among young people, getting some senates and other university movements to support it, and propagandizing a generation or generations of students in favor of thinking of Israel as the worst human rights violator in the world. It is academic malpractice to support the BDS movement because it's based on a lie. Israel has one of the best human rights records in the world. When I debated BDS at Oxford University, I challenged the students to name a single country in the world faced with threats similar to those faced by Israel that has a better record of human rights, higher compliance with the rule of law, and more concern for the lives of enemy non-combatants, enemy civilians. Not a single student at the Oxford Union could think of a country that had a better record, because the reality is there is none. And yet Israel is the only country that's subject to any kind of a boycott, divestment, sanction movement on college campuses. College campuses today, you can't get a demonstration about Syria, even though hundreds of thousands of people, innocent civilians, many of them, have been murdered. You couldn't get a demonstration about Darfur. You couldn't get a demonstration about Rwanda. College students today focus almost exclusively on the imperfections of Israel. And that's bigotry, and that's bias, and that ought to be called what it is, in the same way that the BDS movement is bigoted and biased and racist and anti-Semitic, and ought to be confronted in exactly that way. We need a single standard applying to all countries in the world. If you want to have a BDS movement, fine. List every country in the world in terms of the three factors that I've mentioned, including a fourth factor of, do you have access to the media to contradict or go to the courts to dissent in your country? Those are the factors. And then list every country in the world. Israel would be about 196th on a list of 200 instead of number one. Well, Israel is not only number one, it's number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are no other countries on the BDS list. So we ought to expose BDS for what it is. But it is succeeding in its propaganda efforts while failing in its effort to actually achieve divestment or boycott, at least on American campuses.
All right, Professor Dershowitz, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for your time. I also want to thank all of our guests, especially Knesset member Sharon Haskell, Colonel Daniel Reisner, and Miri Eisen. If you'd like Professor Dershowitz to answer your questions, go to iltv.tv or our Facebook page and submit them. We'll see you again next week.